Jonathan had always considered his life to be fairly peaceful. He had long since retired, enjoying the peacefulness of walking the morning streets of his town. His parents, who died several years ago, had always seemed to him to be an example of stability. They hadn't left him much, but enough to live without worries. But with each passing month, more and more questions piled up that Jonathan could not find answers to. One day, while going through his parents' old clothes, he accidentally came across a heavy box that was hidden in the back of their wardrobe. His hands trembled a little as he opened it, and what he saw came as a shock to him. In the box were several financial documents that he had never seen before. There were bills, loans, and documents about debts he could not even imagine. He read the numbers that their parents had to pay, and his heart became heavy. Why had they never told him about this? How had these debts gone unnoticed while he was going about his business? Jonathan looked at the documents, and many questions came to mind. How could this have happened? How could his parents have so seriously neglected their financial future, leaving nothing for him? He was the eldest child, and now it was all coming at him. Jonathan spent the next few days studying the documents and trying to understand how the debts had come about. He started looking for additional facts, trying to figure out why his parents had never mentioned it, even when it came to his financial aid. During his investigation, he found out that his parents had taken out large loans that they had never even mentioned. They spent more than they earned, and instead of planning for their old age, they accumulated debts that were now becoming his own burden. Jonathan felt his heart clench with anger and regret. How could this have happened? And why hadn't he noticed it before? With each new document he found, Jonathan lost more and more confidence that it wasn't too late to fix this. He had only one thoughting: how will he go on with his life if his debts are so high that even selling his house won't help cover them? And more importantly, does he have the right to retribution for other people's mistakes? And could this be a chance for him to repay his parents? These questions haunted him. He realized that his old age would no longer be what he had imagined. But how could he fix it when his pension was just a drop in the bucket of money he needed? Jonathan Clark was a man who many considered to be quiet, even a bit reserved. He was 65 years old, and at first glance his life looked typical for a retired person. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, where every day began with a cup of hot coffee, a walk in the garden, and reading the newspaper. Though Head did not seek entertainment, travel, or meet friends. His world consisted of four walls, familiar faces, and the constant routine he loved so much. His pension was enough to cover basic expenses, and although he couldn't afford expensive entertainment, it was enough for him. Jonathan rarely thought about his parents. They had died a few years ago, and after their passing, he decided to leave things as they were. Their home, which he had enjoyed as a child, now stood empty. He remembered his parents as hard, working, and humble people, someone who was always focused on providing their son with a comfortable life. They lived frugally, planning every step of the way, and even when they were older, they always kept their finances on track. One morning, as usual, Jonathan woke up at 6, and the sun was just beginning to rise and the fog was still covering the town. He sat down in the kitchen, drank his coffee, and looked at the old photo album on the table. He still remembered those fun days when his parents were still alive, and how they had taught him to save, putting away every penny for the future. Jonathan laughed as he recalled their stern advice about the importance of living debt-free. He always believed they had set a good example for him. But this morning, like many mornings before, things went wrong, and Jonathan received news he hadn't expected. An envelope with a red stamp appeared on his desk. The sight of this letter immediately made his heart catch his breath. It was a letter from the bank. Jonathan could feel his hand trembling as he tore open the envelope. The bank was informing him that they had discovered serious irregularities in the documents for the accounts that once belonged to his parents. At first, He couldn't understand what this meant, but after he carefully reread the letter, he realized the terrible truthing his parents had left huge debts that were now automatically passed on to him. Jonathan could not believe his eyes. How could it be possible that his parents, who had always said that debt was a terrible sin and that they would never lend money, had left him such a heavy burden? He could not understand why they had never mentioned it. Why didn't they tell him when they were alive? Did they hope he wouldn't find out? Or maybe they thought it didn't matter because they had left him the house anyway. His heart was pounding in his chest and his mind couldn't accept this reality. With his pension barely enough to cover the basics, how was he supposed to cope with this financial storm? His parents had left him not wealth, but debt, and now he was forced to find a way out of this desperate situation. Jonathan spent the next few days in constant tension. He began contacting banks, studying documents, looking for any clue that could help him understand exactly how much he owed and how to settle it. Each time he contacted a lawyer or financial advisor, he received more frustration than answers. The debts turned out to be huge and complex. They included loans for different purchases, unclear interest rates, and repayments that no one could see. His frustration was growing. He was old, and it was getting harder and harder to find money. He could no longer work, and even selling the house his parents had left him was not enough to cover his debts. Jonathan didn't know who to turn to, and this feeling of helplessness never left him. In those moments when he sat in his favorite chair, looking at old photos and thinking about his parents, Jonathan felt a heavy guilt. He wondered if he hadn't had a chance to see this coming earlier, if there was no way to avoid this disaster. Why didn't he ask more when his parents were still alive? Maybe if he had been more attentive, things could have been different. But now it was too late. Jonathan knew that his life had changed forever. Not only did he have to deal with his own financial problems, but he also had to untangle the secret web of debt that his parents had left him. It was not just a financial problem. It was a psychological trauma that haunted him. How could he look at his parents now with what they had left behind? Jonathan sat in his chair, wrapping his fingers around his cup of cold coffee, unable to bring himself to get up. The letter from the bank that he had received a few days ago was still on his mind. He read it over and over again, but not a single paragraph answered the questions that tormented his soul. And he knew that the debts his parents had left behind were huge, but how much and how they had gotten into this financial trap, he didn't know. All these years Jonathan lived with the conviction that his parents, always so careful in financial matters, were free of debt. They strictly adhered to the principle of living within their means, and never borrowed money. So he thought he had nothing to worry about. But for some reason this letter now made him doubt everything. He felt something heavy pressing on his chest. Something he could not understand. One evening, sitting at home trying to sort through the papers, Jonathan decided that he needed to dig deeper. His late parents had left behind not only a house, but also several old boxes of papers. He knew that one of these boxes must contain various important documents, tax reports, bills, maybe even notarized contracts. He had never looked into these boxes before, hoping that none of it mattered. But now he realized that these documents could answer the questions that had arisen after the letter from the bank. For several hours, Jonathan sorts through the papers that had accumulated in these boxes, but finds nothing specific. He comes across old electricity, phone, tax, and insurance receipts, but nothing that could directly point to the problem. His patience gradually begins to wear thin, and he is ready to give up when he notices a small envelope hidden between several of the old receipts. This envelope has no stamp or address. There is only one single inscription on it, for Jonathan. He tears it open and finds several sheets of small handwriting inside. At first glance, it looks like a banal note. However, after Jonathan reads the first few lines, anxiety flashes through his mind. I don't want you to know the truth. Forgive us, but we are leaving you what we can. Just don't contact the bank, don't contact them. It's only a matter of time. The text was short, but so emotional that Jonathan could feel his heart pounding in his chest. His hands were shaking as he continued to read. On Akira, there were a few more words at the end of the letter that made his eyes glaze over. An additional loan has been issued in your name. It will be difficult to pay, but we couldn't do it any other way. It was his first real hint of what his parents had been hiding from him. Jonathan had never heard of this extra loan. His parents had always assured him that their finances were fine and never asked for help. Now that he discovered this letter, all of his previous beliefs began to crumble. Jonathan could not believe that his parents had kept such important information from him for so long. The loan in his name was no longer just a small mistake. And it was a big debt that was now on his shoulders, and he had no idea how to handle it. All his thoughts about his inheritance, about what he would receive from his parents, now became meaningless. But it was not a gift, but a burden from which he could not escape. All those days that followed the discovery of this letter, Jonathan began to feel like a man on the brink. He could not just stop. This little letter was the first link in a chain of clues that he thought would lead to the greatest discoveries of his life. He began to dig into all the details in the documents, trying to find more information about this loan, and more he felt that the essence of this story was much more complicated than he could have imagined. What was really hidden behind these documents? Why had his parents left him such a heavy legacy? And most importantly, how could he now find a way to resolve it? Jonathan was gripped by a sense of deep anxiety. Although he felt that with every new hint he discovered, this story was becoming more and more unpredictable. And the worst part was that he didn't know how to end it. He just kept digging deeper, each time plunging into more doubts and questions. And now he couldn't stop. Now it was not only a question of finances, but also of his own identity, truth, and what was left after everything. Jonathan sat in his room, mulling over everything he had learned over the past few days. The letter he had found among the old papers had revealed a dark and confusing story that his parents had carefully hidden. He couldn't believe his eyes. But each new letter, each new entry in the bank records only confirmed his worst suspicions. He found copies of loan agreements drawn up in his name. At first, he thought it was just a mistake. But the more he looked at these documents, the more he realized that it was not an accident, but a systematic lie hidden problems that he had never noticed. Jonathan realized that his parents were not just in debt, they lived in constant fear of creditors, hiding their financial disaster from him. Gradually, he began to reconstruct the picture behind their decisions. Not the debts were not accidental. They were the result of irresponsibility, bad financial decisions, and even emotional decisions that his parents made when they tried to provide themselves with some comfort in their old age. They chose the path of borrowing, ending to maintain the appearance of prosperity, regardless of the consequences. After a few hours of reading the documents, Jonathan began to realize that this was not just one mistake. His parents had taken out several large loans from different banks for purchases they couldn't really afford. One loan after another, the interest rate was rising, and they couldn't find a way back. Every attempt they made to cover their debts led to even more problems. They even started taking out loans to pay for the previous ones. It was a path that became fatal. Jonathan could not understand why they did not ask him for help, why they did not tell him the truth. He was an adult and could have helped, but they didn't. They decided not to put him under stress by hiding the real situation from him until it was too late. With each new document he discovered, Jonathan realized that his parents had in fact not only taken out loans, but had also entered into deals with dubious companies, using their retirement savings as collateral. And his parents chose not to mention this, even when it became obvious. Jonathan understood that this situation was the inevitable result of their decisions, but he also felt a deep sense of betrayal. That day was a turning point for Jonathan. If he hadn't started disclosing these documents, he would never have learned that his parents' hidden debts were the cause of many of their problems, not only financial, but emotional as well. He remembered how often they tried to pretend that everything was fine. Their indifference, their willingness to turn a blind eye to reality, all of this was now clear. Now he faced a new problem: what to do with this knowledge. How to explain to himself why his parents had done what they had done. He could not believe that it was all so confusing. He had to follow the trail of every decision, every loan, every payment, and he was starting to feel lost in this financial chaos. He didn't know how to get out of what was left after that. But the worst part was that these debts were now becoming his problem. They had to be resolved, and the responsibility now fell on his shoulders. What was the next step? Jonathan could not let this go unanswered. I could not just sit back and do nothing. These debts were not just theirs, they were now his. How could he fix what was left behind after they left? How could he turn his life around without falling into an even bigger financial abyss? Jonathan knew that he would have to sort through all of this paperwork, possibly consult a lawyer. He tried to convince himself that he should look for a solution, but the more he thought about it, the more he felt fear pressing in. It was not just debts. It was a whole life that was intertwined with financial mistakes, shortcomings, and now it was all on his shoulders. And he didn't know how to deal with it. And now Jonathan was faced with a choice: to continue living with this bitter truth, or to find a way to resolve it, no matter how difficult it might be. Now it was filled with new, difficult questions that he could not ignore. A lot of time had passed, and perhaps the biggest challenge was that he now had to find out if he was capable of coping with the shadow this financial ruin left behind. Each day after Jonathan learned the truth seemed harder than the last. He sat in his room, looking through piles of documents, trying to find some kind of solution. His parents' debts, which he could no longer ignore, were getting bigger and more complicated. It seemed that the more he dug, the deeper he fell into this hole. All these days he tried to understand how he could reverse the situation, but there were no answers. Jonathan woke up in the morning with a sense of anxiety, feeling that every moment was bringing him closer to doing what he feared. And it was only a matter of time before he would be able to cope with this catastrophe, or would it just make his life cloudy? The debts that had become his were pressing down on him, and the fear of the consequences made him withdraw even more. Jonathan didn't know how to begin. Every part of his life was now tied to those documents, and there was no room for easy solutions. But he couldn't throw them away because he knew that these debts were part of his future, and he couldn't avoid responsibility. Jonathan decided to contact a financial advisor. It seemed like the only way to deal with this disaster. However, even counseling did not bring him relief. After a few sessions, he realized that every decision he made would have new consequences. The struggle with debts could last for years. He recalled all those endless visits to banks, phone calls from debt collectors, and numerous bills that remained unpaid. It was a struggle without end. Was it worth it for him to fight for it? Perhaps the best thing to do would have been to just give up, to recognize that he was not in a position to solve the problem. Giving up the struggle might have brought some relief, but it would have been an escape route he could not afford. He spent several days contemplating this decision. He did not want to be a fugitive. But did he have the strength and resources to go through this difficult path? The phone call broke the silence of his home again. Jonathan could feel his heart beating faster. He knew who was on the line. The debt collectors were no longer trying to hide their demands. The tone of their conversations was cold and hostile, reminding Jonathan that they were not joking. Every day became harder and harder, and even if he made the decision to fight, he was not prepared for what he would face. After another call, Jonathan hung up and felt powerless again. His life had been a collaborative process between his parents from the beginning, and now it was a horrible legacy that he had to try to fix. Perhaps there was no more room to fix this situation, only a burden. He seemed to be on the verge of collapse, not knowing what to do next. After much thought, Jonathan began to think about other possibilities. He contacted a lawyer to find out what bankruptcy options were available in his situation. A lawyer explained to him that this was not the best solution, but in extreme cases he could file for bankruptcy, which would allow him to get rid of his debts. However, this was not an easy decision. The bankruptcy procedure could last several years and leave negative consequences on his credit history that would prevent him from restoring his financial situation. On the one hand, it seemed like a possible way to get rid of his obligations and start fresh, but on the other hand, Jonathan was not ready to give up his sense of responsibility. It was a choice that could affect his future, and this decision was not only financial, but also moral. With all of these options on the table, Jonathan felt overwhelmed. Should he fight for every dollar or accept the consequences of his situation? It was not only a question of money, but also of his moral choice. If he chose to fight, it meant that he would recognize his responsibility and try to build a new life despite all the difficulties. But if he refused, would he be able to live with this bitter truth? The difficulty of this decision was that neither he nor his parents could have foreseen the consequences of their mistake. And although Jonathan felt devastated, he realized that his decision now would determine not only his future, but also how he would live with the consequences of his wrong choices. Jonathan sat at the dining room table, trying to concentrate. There were several men and women in the room, including his sister Sarah and brother Michael. They had talked about this topic a few times before, but never really taken it seriously. Now that they had finally forced themselves to meet, the atmosphere was tense. We can't ignore these debts. It's not just a matter of money, it's a matter of our family, Jonathan said, trying to find balance in his words. The word, debt, sounded almost like a curse, like a word that made everyone stay away from each other. But he had nowhere to run from this reality. Sarah sat in silence, her eyes focused on the table, as if searching for answers to questions that never got answered. She was always the one who tried to keep the peace in the family. Michael, on the other hand, was more radical. He was ready to go all the way, no matter what the cost. "We have to sell the house," Michael said, ignoring the reactions of the others. His voice sounded decisive, but there was a coldness to it. "What do you mean?" asked Jonathan, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to understand what he was getting at. Selling the house. This was his childhood home, the place where he grew up, where his parents had lived all these years. There's nothing else to do. If we don't start doing something now, our problems are only going to get worse," Michael replied, now looking at Jonathan. His tone was hard and decisive. Sarah could not remain silent. She raised her head and looked at Jonathan and then at Michael, her eyes filled with indignation. "You want us to sell this house? Is that what you're suggesting? Maybe we can find other ways. We can't just give up so easily." Sarah's voice was full of emotion and she was breathing heavily. "You don't understand," replied Michael, breaking the last vestiges of calm. "You know we can't afford anything else. If we want to save any future, we have to act fast. Otherwise, this debt will consume us all." The room became quiet. Jonathan could feel the situation getting more and more difficult. His heart was beating faster and his mind was racing. How could they make such a decision? How could he accept that his family would lose everything? "We can talk to the bank, ask for a debt restructuring." "There are options, really," said Sarah, trying to find another way out. She was always the one who looked for softer ways. "We don't have to just give up. There are other ways." But Michael did not share her optimism. He was convinced that every attempt to avoid reality would only prolong the situation and make them weaker. "Talk to the bank. What will happen? They'll just swallow us up with their interest and terms," he replied, clearly disappointed by her suggestion. Jonathan thought about the situation. He realized that this was not just about money, it was about how they saw their family, how each of them accepted reality. His brother was determined to fight, even if it meant taking drastic steps. And his sister tried to stay calm, but also recognized that the situation had become too difficult. Jonathan was torn between two extremes. He did not want to make a decision that could upset the balance in the family. Emma, however, with each passing day, the debt was becoming more insurmountable, and he knew that the longer they delayed, the harder it would be to find a way to a solution. The hardest part of it was that he couldn't find understanding even within his family. Could he accept the decision of Michael, who was ready to lose everything, or the decision of Sarah, who did not want to give up family ties? And, most importantly, was he ready to leave everything they had built their lives on? The whole situation felt like a trap they had fallen into without a clear answer. The pressure from all sides was unbearable. The family began to split apart, each defending their own point of view, not realizing that this was no longer just a financial problem. It was a matter of their common future. The silence that followed was unusually long, and everyone sat in silence, as if waiting for the first person to say the word that would change everything. But Jonathan realized that this word would not come. They all knew that the decision was not made on the basis of reason alone, but also on the basis of fear and emotion. But in that moment, Jonathan realized one thing: no matter how hard they tried to resolve the issue, his parents' debts had become an invisible wall that could not be passed painlessly. He was faced with a choice: either to break down the wall altogether or to try to get around it. Jonathan was sitting in his small office, tapping away at his computer with great hope and fear in his heart. His hands were shaking with tension, but he couldn't stop. The debts his parents had left him were a heavy burden. Every day he worried not only about his financial future, but also about how it would affect his family. However, Jonathan knew he could not just give up. He was ready to fight. He spent all those weeks exploring his options. He had to find a solution that would not lead to disaster. Selling the house, as Michael suggested, was the most obvious option. But Jonathan couldn't accept the idea. It was not just a house, it was a story, a part of his life. How can you lose everything you love just because of debt? Other options were not inspiring either. The bank, of course, was ready to help, but it meant new loans, even higher interest rates, and longer repayment terms. What if it didn't work out again? What if there were even more problems in the future? He decided to start by seeking advice from financial experts. Jonathan reached out to several people to see if there were any other options. From time to time, he thought he was about to find a solution, but each new contact and each new meeting only added to his frustration. We can run a debt restructuring, but it will mean an increase in monthly payments for several years, one of the financial advisors explained. Or perhaps you can turn to law firms that help people resolve such issues, but it can be an expensive and very time-consuming process. Jonathan sat in his office, mulling over every word. Restructuring. How could that help? This whole process would only drag them into a dead end. And every day they would find themselves deeper in debt. Something in his heart told him there was a better way. He just hadn't found it yet. The same day Jonathan spoke with the counselor, he received a call from Sarah. Her voice was different. She was never particularly stressed, but this time Jonathan heard fear in her words. "John, I think I found something interesting. It might help us with our debts," Sarah said, trying to sound confident, even though her voice was shaking. She sent him a link to a website with a new financial product that promised to help debtors without having to take drastic steps, such as selling property or taking on new debt. It's a company that specializes in debt relief through various financial strategies, Sarah explained. Jonathan quickly reviewed the information. At first, it seemed good to be true, But then he came across testimonials from people who had already used the service and were able to reduce their debts without serious financial loss. This is a chance, Jonathan thought. His heart was racing with excitement. He could see a small ray of hope at the end of the tunnel. The next day, he contacted the company's representative. They quickly set up a meeting and discussed how it could work in his case. The financiers offered a scheme where Jonathan could reduce the amount of his debt, agree on a payment schedule, and avoid all the unpleasant procedures that would be required in a restructuring. The was not an easy path, but it was an opportunity. Jonathan realized that he could get out of this situation without losing everything he held so dear. The company promised to help him in the process of negotiating with the banks to change the terms of debt repayment. However, each step raised even more questions. What if the bank refused? What if the whole scheme didn't work? He could feel his heart getting heavier with uncertainty. But, on the other hand, this was the only chance he could rely on. Time was running out. Jonathan realized that even in the best-case scenario, he would have to change a lot of things in his life. He thought about everything: his family, his business, his old, cozy home. All these things were now becoming parts of one big puzzle that he could not solve in one day. But he was ready to fight. He couldn't afford to give up, couldn't let everything his parents had built go down the drain. With a shudder, he realized that every step in the process would be difficult and painful. But the sooner he started, the more chances he would have to change the situation in his favor. Finally, Jonathan decided to take action. He would not just sit back and wait for what would happen next. He was going to fight for his family's future, despite all the difficulties he would face. All these steps, even the smallest ones, mattered. They were his only chance for salvation. The next day was Jonathan's moment of truth. He had to make an important call and inform the company of his decision. It was hard to let go of this burden, but he was ready to give himself a chance for a new life. A life that was not reduced to debt and constant fear for the future. Jonathan was sitting in his favorite chair with his arms around his head, looking at his laptop screen. All options, all possible solutions led to one fatal point. He could not turn back. To choose the path that would save his finances and his family, he had to take the step he dreaded most, a decision that would change his life. From the moment Jonathan learned about the extent of his parents' debt, he tried to find a way out. He had been watching every step, looking for alternatives, trying to avoid the final decision that had become inevitable. But today was the day when there were no other options. All the doors he tried to open were closed. Almost all that was left was to sell the house. He knew it would cut off his connection to what had once been the foundation of his life, but he had no other choice. Jonathan opened the mail. The last message from his bank contained an official letter, a warning of liquidation, if a substantial amount was not paid by the end of the month. It was officially if he didn't find the money by the end of the week, all would be lost. What happened next? If it wasn't for this notice, he could have delayed his decision for a few more weeks. But now there was no choice. He called his brother Michael, trying to gather his last thoughts. We have to sell the house, Jonathan said, trying to sound calm. If we want to save anything, we have to act. Michael was silent for a few seconds, as if mulling over the decision. Then he answered quietly, I can't believe it. Are you serious? We can't lose everything because of this debt. What else can we do? Asked Jonathan, feeling his chest tighten. We have to do this, otherwise everything will be lost. The house is all we have. If we don't do this, we'll be left with nothing. This decision hit Jonathan like a lightning strike, and he knew that with this step he was changing everything. All the years he had lived in this house, all the memories, all the important moments, now all of it would become part of the past. Jonathan got up from his chair and went to the window. Looked at the garden where he and his parents had once planted trees. Every corner of this house was a part of his history. He spent his youth here, and his children were born here. and now he had to give this house away for the sake of debts they could not repay. It was his decision. But deep down, he felt that it would be more than just a financial choice. It would be a choice that would determine his future. And when this house disappeared from his life, a part of him would disappear with it. He could not go back. It was a point of no return. A phone call interrupted his thoughts. It was a real estate agent who was supposed to help him sell the house. Jonathan decided that without waiting any longer, he had to act. "Okay, I'm in," he said. Let's get started." The agent's voice was calm, and the feeling of letting go of it all hit him like a wave. He knew that this was a step that would make it impossible to go back to the way things were. And even if this money saved him from financial ruin, it would not bring him happiness. When Jonathan hung up the phone, his heart was beating so fast, it felt like it was trying to break out of his chest. The loss of his home was not just the loss of property, it was the loss of everything he considered important in life. And he closed his eyes and felt every corner of this house bursting into his memory, as if the brightest moments of his past were unfolding again. But what could he do? He looked at the bills, at the debts, at how these amounts were growing every month. He couldn't afford to just sit back and watch everything fall apart. And now this feeling of heaviness was like a stone in his heart. And he was responsible for all these debts. And now he had to choose between saving his home and saving his future. Jonathan looked at his family, who had been with him all along the way. His wife, Suzanne, sat next to him and held his hand. He saw her trying not to show fear, but her eyes said it all. She was afraid, and he knew it. But she supported him, even when this decision was so difficult. "Are you sure this is the only way out?" "Ara?" she asked quietly, as if she was afraid to break the silence hovering between them. "I don't know," Jonathan replied. "But if I don't do it, we can't save anything. We have to save what we can." She sighed and turned to him, maintaining a calm demeanor, but Jonathan knew it was only a facade. They both felt that their lives would never be the same again. The point of no return had been reached. The life that had been up to that point no longer existed. He could not go back. Jonathan sat in the empty room that had once been the living room of his home. It was the last place he had ever felt at home. Now he looked at the walls that were left empty after everything was sold or auctioned off. The same walls where he and his family had laughed, cried, and been comforted when life had a common purpose. Now he sat here alone, surrounded by silence. He closed his eyes and felt his heart clench. The loss of his home was just one of many losses. He had lost not only his home, but also a part of himself. This house was more than just walls and a roof. It was a symbol of his family, his past, his hopes for the future. And now it was all gone. Jonathan thought about what he had done. Was it the right thing to do? Perhaps he could have done things differently, joined forces with his brothers and sisters, asked for help from the bank, or even tried to find some other way to solve the problem. But he knew he didn't have time, and he had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. His thoughts traveled back in time to when he was younger. Jonathan remembered how he had dreamed of this house when he and his wife first moved in. They were young, full of hope, and it seemed that life promised only better prospects. They built this house with their own hands, put a part of their soul into it, and every stone here was a symbol of their desire for the future. But now, as he looked at the empty walls, it became clear to him that even the best hopes could fall apart. There was no room to return to what had been, no way to regain what had been lost. Like he realized that the debt, like an invisible shadow, would always follow him. And every time he thought of that house, he felt that shadow slowly swallowing him up. What happened to that optimistic Jonathan who believed in his future? Where is the one who stood firmly on his feet, ready to face any challenge of life? All of that dissolved in this tumultuous flow of debt and unfulfilled promises. Jonathan picked up his last correspondence with the bank, looking at it on the table. These documents carried not only signed numbers, but also the bitter truth. The feeling of lost time gripped him like an invisible horror. Only what was left after that. Only a lot of doubts and questions about whether something could have been done differently. What will happen next? He asked himself without even waiting for an answer. Oh, he knew that the debt would not disappear. All that remained after this disaster were dashed hopes and new challenges. Jonathan realized that now he would have to start over. But would he have the strength to do so? And even though this heavy feeling of disappointment was a heavy burden, he felt one thing: he had to move forward. Yes, everything was lost, but that didn't mean that everything in his life was over. Jonathan thought about his family, about his wife. Suzanne had been with him in every decision, and she had supported him even when he himself doubted the rightness of his steps. Now, when they had both lost everything, he needed to think not only about himself, but also about her, about the children, about their opportunities for recovery. We're still together, he thought. We can start again even if we have nothing. That's all we have left. But the question, will they have enough strength, remained. Would they be able to come back? Would he be able to learn to accept his mistakes and move on, even when all this pain inside made him doubt? He looked at the photos on the wall, moments from the past that now seemed so far away. His family was there, all happy and healthy. He was sure then that only bright prospects lay ahead. Now it seemed so unattainable. It was hard for him to believe that he could restore his faith in the future. We still have a chance, he said quietly to himself, feeling how hard it was to say the words. We can still change everything. But there was no certainty in his heart. There was only hope. At the end of the day, Jonathan realized that life doesn't wait, and you can't always rely on it. But the only thing he could do now was learn to live with what he had left. Sometimes you have to learn from your mistakes and believe that you can start again, even when everything seems lost. And it was hard. Extremely hard. But no matter how hard it was, he could not stop. Because life goes on.